Somewhere deep along the cypress-lined tributaries of the Combahee River in South Carolina, a secret ritual unfolded every Sunday evening, one so unsettling that it remained hidden for more than a century. For nearly 8 years, 37 enslaved women were forced to take part in a strange weekly game on the Harfield estate. This wasn't a punishment in the usual sense. There were no whips, no chains, no physical torment. Yet witnesses described something far worse. Women who stopped speaking entirely, women who communicated only with gestures, women whose silence became so complete that overseers feared them. Historical records from the Beaufort district show something even stranger. From 1847 to 1855, not a single enslaved woman over the age of 14 was ever sold, traded, or removed from the property, a nearly impossible anomaly in the South, whispered about by neighboring planters, but never investigated. So what kind of man, educated in Europe, respected in Charleston, wealthy beyond measure, would design a ritual so psychologically devastating that it had to be buried in private letters, coded ledgers, and unmarked archives? And why did they call him only the Baron? Before we go deeper into this forgotten darkness, I need you to do one thing: subscribe to Vintage Chains right now. These hidden stories, the ones history tried to erase, deserve to be told. And drop a comment below telling me which country you're watching from. Your voice helps bring these buried truths back to the surface. Now, let's discover what really happened in those Sunday evening gatherings and why the truth was hidden for so long. The Harfield plantation stretched across nearly 2,000 acres of prime low country land. Its main house a testament to the wealth accumulated through rice cultivation and the labor of over 200 enslaved people. But our story centers not on the fields or the grand architecture, but on a man who arrived there in the autumn of 1846, carrying with him ideas that would transform routine cruelty into something far more insidious. The South Carolina Low Country of the 1840s operated under its own particular codes, a society built on rice, indigo, and the brutal mathematics of human bondage. The Beaufort district, where our story unfolds, contained some of the wealthiest planters in the entire South, men whose fortunes rivaled those of European nobility. The landscape itself seemed designed for concealment, vast estates separated by miles of marsh and forest, where Spanish moss hung from ancient oaks like funeral shrouds, and where the thick humidity muffled sound and obscured vision beyond a few hundred yards. Harfield had belonged to the Gaillard family for 3 generations before financial troubles forced its sale in 1846. The buyer, a man who introduced himself simply as Baron Edward Fournier, claimed French Creole ancestry from Louisiana, though his accent suggested time spent in France itself. He was 42 years old, unmarried, and possessed of what contemporaries described as uncommon refinement and scholarly disposition. His library reportedly contained over 3,000 volumes, many in French and German, covering subjects from philosophy to the emerging science of phrenology. What set Fournier apart from neighboring planters was not his wealth, which was substantial, or his education, which was exceptional, but his approach to the management of enslaved labor. He believed, as he wrote in letters to his factor in Charleston, that the science of control lies not in the lash, but in the architecture of the mind. He had studied the writings of Jeremy Bentham on the panopticon, the theories of alienists regarding moral treatment of the insane, and the philosophical works of Kant on duty and obedience. In his twisted interpretation, he saw an opportunity to conduct what he termed social experiments on a captive population. Among the enslaved people already living on Harrowfield when Fournier arrived were 37, women and girls over the age of 14. Their names are recorded in the plantation ledger with careful notation. Hannah, age 23, field hand, mother of 2. Patience, age 19, house servant. Minnie, age 16, seamstress. DIA, age 31, cook. Each entry noted not just age and occupation, but something unusual: measurements of head circumference, notations about temperament, observations about speech patterns, and apparent intelligence. Within weeks of his arrival, Fournier made an announcement that puzzled his white overseers but terrified those who understood its implications. Every enslaved woman and girl above 14 would attend a mandatory gathering each Sunday evening after the day's abbreviated Sabbath work. Attendance was not optional. The gatherings would take place in a renovated tobacco barn that Fournier had converted for this explicit purpose. Fitted with benches arranged in a semicircle and lit by whale oil lamps that cast deep shadows into the rafters. The white overseers were barred from these meetings. Fournier insisted on conducting them alone with only one exception: a free woman of color named Celeste Morant, whom he had brought with him from Louisiana. Celeste's role was never entirely clear to observers, but letters suggest she served as a kind of assistant, recording observations and managing certain practical elements of what Fourier called the exercises. The first gathering occurred on Sunday, October 18, 1846. Just as the sun set behind the live oaks and the evening chorus of frogs began in the nearby rice fields, 37 women filed into the converted barn, their faces betraying the fear that came from not knowing what new horror awaited them. What they found inside was unexpected. The room was clean, almost comfortable, with benches cushioned by simple fabric. A small platform stood at one end, and on it rested a single chair and a small table bearing a leather-bound journal and an inkwell. Fournier stood before them, dressed not in the rough clothes of plantation management, but in a fine suit, more appropriate for a Charleston drawing room. When he spoke, his voice was soft, almost gentle, lacking any of the harsh commands they associated with white authority. This itself was unsettling. Violence, they understood. Violence had a logic, but this studied courtesy. This performance of civility in a space of absolute powerlessness signaled something far more dangerous. "Ladies," Fournier began, and the word itself was so unexpected that several women visibly startled. Enslaved women were never called ladies. "We gather here to engage in an exercise that I believe will prove beneficial to all. You will come to understand that I am not a cruel man. I do not believe in unnecessary suffering, but I do believe in order and structure and the proper arrangement of society according to natural law. What we will do here each week is quite simple, and if you follow the rules precisely, no harm will come to anyone." He gestured to the journal on the table. "This book contains the names of everyone who lives on this property, every enslaved person, every child, every man and woman who labors in my fields. Each week, we will play a game of sorts. The rules are as follows. You will cast votes. You will choose by secret ballot. One person whose name appears in this book, the person who receives the most votes, will receive a consequence." The silence in the room was absolute. Outside, an owl called from the darkness, and someone's breathing became audible in the stillness. "The consequence," Fourier continued, "will vary. It may be a change in work assignment. It may be a reduction in rations for 1 week. It may be denial of the Sunday visit privileges some of you enjoy. The specific consequence is mine to determine. Your task is simply to make the selection. You must vote. Abstention is not permitted, and the ballots are secret. Neither I nor anyone else will know how each individual voted. Only the final tally will be revealed." He paused, letting his words settle over them like a suffocating blanket. "I know what you're thinking. You believe you can all simply vote for yourselves or for some clever strategy to nullify the exercise. But understand this, if I detect any pattern suggesting coordination or conspiracy, if, for instance, every vote goes to the same person, or if votes are distributed too evenly to be natural, then I will determine the consequence myself, and it will be far worse than anything resulting from your honest participation. The game requires genuine choice. It requires that you truly consider who among your community is most deserving of whatever consequence I deem appropriate." Celeste Marchand stepped forward, then carrying a small wooden box and slips of paper. Her face was unreadable, and none of the women could discern whether she was complicit in this scheme or merely another victim with slightly different circumstances. She distributed the paper and small pieces of charcoal for marking, explaining in her Louisiana-inflected French Creole that each woman should write a name and fold the paper before placing it in the box. The first evening stretched into an hour of silence, broken only by quiet sobbing and whispered prayers. How could they choose? To vote for anyone was to participate in their own oppression, to become agents of the system that enslaved them. Yet to refuse was to invite something worse, some undefined punishment that Fournier's careful words had implied without specifying. Hannah, the 23-year-old field hand, would later tell her daughter what went through her mind that night. She thought about voting for herself, believing that whatever consequence befell her would be preferable to choosing another. But then she thought about her 2 children, about who would care for them if her rations were reduced and she weakened, or if her work assignment changed to something more brutal. She thought about the sick strategy of it, how Fournier had constructed a scenario where even self-sacrifice became a form of abandoning others. The votes were cast. Fournier counted them himself, making notations in his journal as Celeste held a lamp for him to see. He announced the results in that same soft voice. Lily, age 53, received 11 votes. Lily was a woman who worked in the laundry, known for her kindness and her skill at herbal remedies that ease the suffering of others. The consequence, Fournier announced, was that for the next week, Lily would be forbidden from speaking to anyone except when directly addressed by an overseer or by Fournier himself. As the women filed out that night, the full horror of what had been constructed became clear. They had been made complicit, they had been forced to choose which of their own would suffer, and the selection had fallen on one of the most beloved members of their community. The silence that had preceded the game became even heavier afterward, laden with shame and fear and the terrible knowledge that this would happen again. The game continued every Sunday evening for the next 8 years, and its effects rippled through the entire enslaved community at Harrowfield in ways both obvious and subtle. The consequences varied in nature and severity, following no discernible pattern that might allow the women to strategize or prepare. One week, the person who received the most votes would have their food rations reduced. Another week, they would be assigned to work in the most brutal section of the rice fields, standing in water from dawn to dusk. Sometimes the consequence was purely psychological, being forced to stand in the center of the circle. The following week, while Fear read aloud from his journal, sharing observations about that person's character, their perceived weaknesses, their secret fears that he had somehow discerned, the architectural genius of Fourier's game lay in its sustainability. It required no violence, no overt cruelty that might attract the attention of visiting planters or raise questions in Charleston society. It was on its surface merely a weekly meeting, a gathering that might even be defended as an attempt at moral instruction or religious education. The actual mechanism of control was invisible, operating entirely within the psychology of those trapped in it. What emerged was a community fractured by mistrust and shame. Women who had once shared their sorrows and supported each other through the daily horrors of enslavement now found themselves wondering, did she vote for me? Was it her name written on those folded slips of paper? The bonds of solidarity that had previously sustained them began to erode, replaced by suspicion and isolation. Some women became convinced they could discern patterns in how the votes fell, developing elaborate theories about alliances and betrayals that may or may not have existed. Fournier kept meticulous records of the voting patterns in his journal, comparing them with his phrenological measurements and his observations of daily behavior. He was attempting in his twisted way to create a taxonomy of human nature under duress to document how people made choices when all choices were corrupted. His letters to a colleague in France, discovered much later in an archive at Tulane University, revealed the pseudo-scientific framework he constructed around his experiment. He wrote of testing the moral limits of social cohesion and observing the breakdown of communal loyalty under sustained psychological pressure. But human beings are more resilient and more complex than Fournier's theories allowed. Within the horror of the game, subtle forms of resistance began to emerge. Some women developed a system of distributing votes as evenly as possible, attempting to ensure that no one person bore the consequence too frequently. Others deliberately voted for those they knew to be strongest, those most likely to endure whatever punishment Fournier devised. A few, in acts of quiet rebellion, consistently voted for the same person themselves in a form of self-sacrifice that Fournier couldn't quite categorize as conspiracy. Hannah became a kind of unelected leader during this period. Though she never held any formal authority, she developed a practice of visiting whoever had been selected the previous week, bringing what small comfort she could manage and offering words of reassurance. She couldn't stop the game, couldn't prevent the consequences, but she could try to maintain the threads of community that Fournier's system was designed to sever. Her presence became a form of testimony. We are still human, still capable of care. Even in this, the plantation's output remained strong during these years. The rice harvests were abundant, the financial records show consistent profits, and Fournier's reputation among the planter class grew as a man of modern methods and efficient management. Visitors to Harrowfield noted the unusual quietness of the enslaved population, particularly the women, but this was often interpreted as evidence of good discipline rather than a symptom of psychological warfare. One visitor, a factor from Charleston named Thomas Apprentice, wrote in his diary after a visit in 1851, "For has achieved something remarkable. His Negroes work with unusual diligence and show none of the troublesome behaviors reported on other estates. The women, in particular, display a docility that speaks well of his management techniques, though I confess the silence among them is somewhat unsettling. Still, one cannot argue with results, or argue with what Apprentice couldn't know without being told was that the silence he observed was not docility, but a collective trauma response. The women of Harrowfield had learned that speech was dangerous, that words could be used against you, that even casual conversation might be recorded in Fournier's journal and later weaponized in some future iteration of the game. So they communicated through glances and gestures, through the sharing of food, or the particular way they folded laundry, through all the small languages that develop in communities under siege. The years accumulated. 1847 became 1848, 1849, 1850. Each Sunday evening, 37 women filed into that barn. Some faces changed as girls reached 14 and were added to the group, while older women occasionally were excused, due to age or infirmity, though this itself became suspect. Was removal from the game a reward or a punishment? New forms of suffering, after all, awaited those who were too old to participate. In the spring of 1852, something shifted. Hannah's daughter Sarah turned 14 and attended her first Sunday gathering. For Hannah, this represented a line crossed, a violation more profound than any she had previously endured. To be subjected to this horror herself was one thing. To watch her child enter the same trap was something else entirely. That night after the votes were cast and they returned to their cabin, Sarah asked her mother a question that would echo through the remaining years at Harrowfield. "Mama, why don't we all just refuse? What could he do if every single one of us simply sat there and didn't vote?" The question was naive in its assumption that collective action was possible, yet it contained within it a seed of something that had been slowly growing in Hannah's mind. Fournier's entire system depended on participation, on the votes being cast and counted. The consequences were terrible, yes, but they were consequences he chose to impose. What if the game itself was disrupted? What if the careful architecture of psychological control he'd constructed was simply refused? Anna knew the risks of such thinking. She'd seen what happened to enslaved people who directly defied white authority. But Sarah's question forced her to articulate something she'd been sensing for years. Fourier was different from other enslavers. His cruelty was more sophisticated but also more fragile. He needed their participation. A traditional overseer could simply increase physical punishments until compliance was achieved. But Fournier had built something more complex, more dependent on psychological submission. If that submission was withdrawn, if the women collectively refused to engage with the framework he'd created, what then? She began to watch him more carefully during the Sunday gatherings, studying not just what he said, but what he didn't say, the moments when his careful composure flickered. She noticed that when votes were distributed too evenly, when it seemed no genuine choosing had occurred, he became agitated in subtle ways. His voice remained calm, but his hands would clench, and he would spend longer writing in his journal, as though trying to recapture some lost data point. Hannah also began to observe Celeste Merchant more closely. The free woman of color remained an enigma, her face betraying nothing as she assisted with the weekly ritual. But there were moments, brief and easy to miss, when something flickered in her expression. Once when Fournier announced a particularly cruel consequence, Celeste's hand trembled slightly as she held the lamp. Another time, Hannah caught her closing her eyes for just a moment as though in pain or prayer. The summer of 1852 was brutally hot, even by low country standards. The rice fields steamed under the relentless sun, and the mosquitoes were so thick that work became nearly unbearable. But something else was happening too. Something less visible, but equally present. The women of Harrowfield were beginning to communicate in new ways, developing a vocabulary of resistance that operated below the threshold of what could be detected or punished. It began with the distribution of votes. Instead of the semi-random patterns that had characterized previous years, the voting began to show deliberate structure. 1 week, every vote but one went to the same person. Patience, the 19-year-old house servant who was known to be among the strongest, most resilient women on the plantation. The next week, the vote split perfectly evenly among all 38 women who now participated, rendering the selection almost meaningless. Fournier was forced to cast a deciding vote himself, something his system hadn't accounted for. He responded by adding new rules. If votes were too evenly distributed, he would simply choose the consequence recipient himself. If they seemed to be coordinating their votes in ways that protected certain individuals, he would double the severity of consequences. But each new rule added complexity to a system that depended on elegant simplicity, and complexity created opportunities for subversion. By the fall of 1853, Fournier's frustration had become palpable. His journal entries from this period, later discovered, show a man increasingly aware that his experiment was failing, but unable to understand exactly how or why. He wrote, "The subjects have developed strategies I did not anticipate. They vote yes. They participate in the formal structure of the exercise, but something essential has been withdrawn. They have found a way to comply while simultaneously resisting. I must redesign the parameters." The redesign came in October of that year. Fournier announced a new variation of the game. Instead of voting for who should receive a consequence, the women would vote for who should receive a reward. The person with the most votes would be given better food for a week, lighter work assignments, and permission to visit family members on neighboring plantations. It was, he explained, a test of their capacity for positive selection, for recognizing merit and virtue among their own. The change was diabolical in its way. It transformed the game from one where participation meant inflicting harm to one where participation meant granting benefit, but it also meant denying benefit to everyone else. And Fournier made clear that the reward was finite. Only one person would receive it, chosen from among 38, meaning that 37 would know they had not been selected. It was a different form of division, but division nonetheless. The first week under the new rules, the vote was nearly unanimous. 36 women voted for Sarah, Hannah's daughter. It was an act of collective defiance disguised as compliance. They had chosen the youngest among them, the one who had posed the question about refusal, and in doing so, they made a statement that Fournier couldn't quite pass. Was it genuine recognition of innocence deserving protection? Was it an attempt to protect Hannah by protecting her child? Was it a message to Sarah herself, a way of saying, "We hear you. We remember who we are"? Fourier was forced to grant Sarah the reward, though he spent that evening writing furiously in his journal, trying to analyze the meaning of the vote. He suspected manipulation, but couldn't prove coordination. The game had always required genuine choice. But how could he distinguish between genuine individual choice and collectively arrived at decisions that were then individually executed? The following week, the votes scattered randomly, as though the women had understood that repeating the same pattern would expose the strategy. But new patterns emerged over subsequent weeks. The votes would cluster around particular types of people, always the youngest or always those who had recently suffered. Under the old consequence system, or always those with children. Messages were being sent, but not in any language Fournier could definitively interpret. This period marked a turning point in another way, too. Celeste Marshall, who had maintained her careful neutrality for 7 years, began to show signs of strain. She made small mistakes during the gatherings, forgetting to bring the ballot box, miscounting votes, arriving late to the Sunday meetings. Once she distributed ballots with names already written on them, a blunder so obvious that Fournier sent her from the room in anger. Hannah watched these developments and began to wonder, was Celeste an ally or simply another victim reaching her breaking point? The question mattered because if there was to be any real change, any escape from the system Fournier had created, it would likely require help from someone with access to the tools and spaces that enslaved people were denied. The winter of 1853-54 brought a cold snap that froze the standing water in the rice fields, a rare occurrence in the Low Country. Work slowed, and the Sunday gatherings took on an even more surreal quality as the women filed into the barn through frost-stiffened grass, their breath visible in the lamplight. Fourier seemed to retreat into his journals during this period, spending more time analyzing past voting patterns than conducting new rounds of the game. It was during this winter that Hannah made her decision. She couldn't end the game through direct confrontation, couldn't simply refuse participation without risking not just her own life but Sarah's and others. But she could do something else. She could ensure that the story of what happened at Harfield wouldn't die in silence. She began to commit everything to memory with deliberate precision, fixing each detail of the game structure, each rule and consequence, every variation Fournier had introduced. She memorized names, dates, specific votes, particular cruelties. And she began to teach this litany to Sarah, whispering the history in their cabin at night, making her daughter repeat it back until every detail was secured. "If we don't survive this," Hannah told Sarah, "you will. and you'll remember. You'll tell what happened here." But Hannah wanted more than memory. She wanted documentation, something that couldn't be dismissed as mere testimony from enslaved women whose words carried no legal weight. She needed access to Fournier's journals or to create documentation of her own. The question was how. The opportunity came from an unexpected direction. In March of 1854, Celeste Merchant approached Hannah while she was working in the laundry. It was a risk for both of them. Celeste's position depended on maintaining distance from the enslaved population, and Hannah could be punished for unauthorized conversation with any white person or free person of color. But Celeste took the risk. "I need to speak with you," she said quietly, her eyes scanning the area to ensure they were alone, about the Sunday gatherings. They met that night in the shadows behind the laundry building, a space made private by the darkness and the constant noise of frogs and insects. Celeste's story came out in fragments, each revelation more devastating than the last. She had been enslaved herself once in Louisiana. Fournier had purchased her freedom in exchange for her assistance with his research. She had believed initially that his methods were somehow more humane than traditional plantation management, that his Sunday gatherings were an alternative to physical violence. But over the years, she'd come to understand the psychological damage being inflicted, damage that was in some ways more profound than the whip because it turned the victims against each other. "I kept his records," Celeste told Hannah. "Every vote, every consequence, every observation he's made. I write them down in his journal, and I've made copies, pages and pages, documenting what he's done here. But I can't do anything with them. If I leave, if I try to expose this, I'll be caught. Even as a free woman, I have no real power. The courts won't listen to me. But you, if you could get these records, if you could find a way to survive this and escape." She trailed off, unable to complete the thought, but trusting Hannah to understand. The records were evidence, documentation that couldn't be explained away or dismissed. They were written in Fournier's own hand with his own analysis and observations. They proved not just that the game existed, but that it was deliberate, calculated, a systematic form of psychological torture. "Where does he keep them?" Hannah asked. "In his study, in a locked desk. But I have access. I could make copies, hide them somewhere you could retrieve them, but it would take time, weeks, maybe months. And it's dangerous if he discovers what I'm doing." Neither of them needed to state the obvious consequences. But Hannah understood that this was the opportunity she'd been hoping for, the chance to create documentation that might someday bring accountability or at least truth to light. Over the following months, Celeste carefully copied pages from Fournier's journals, working late at night when he was asleep or away from the plantation. She transcribed the voting records, the consequences, the pseudo-scientific theories he'd constructed around his experiment. Each page was hidden in a different location on the plantation, buried in a jar beneath the laundry building, tucked into the rafters of the tobacco barn, concealed behind loose boards in the smokehouse. Hannah memorized each location, creating a mental map of where the evidence was scattered, but then Celeste made a mistake. In her careful copying, she left one of the original journal pages on Fournier's desk out of sequence. He noticed immediately. That evening, he summoned Celeste to his study, and though no one witnessed what was said, her screams were heard across the plantation yard. When she emerged hours later, her face was swollen and bruised, and she walked with the rigid control of someone in tremendous pain. The next Sunday, Celeste did not appear at the gathering. Fournier conducted it alone, his manner stiff and controlled, offering no explanation for her absence. The week after that, she was still absent. Whispers began to circulate. Had she run away, been sold, killed? No one knew for certain, and no one dared ask. Hannah felt the weight of Celeste's sacrifice and the added burden of knowing that the copied records existed, but were now vulnerable. If Fourier searched the plantation, if he suspected what Celeste had been doing, he might find and destroy the evidence before anyone else could access it. Time, which had been on Hannah's side when they were carefully building documentation, suddenly became an enemy. Everything depended on what happened next. May 15, 1854 began like any other Sunday at Harrowfield. The women attended the abbreviated church service conducted by a local minister who came monthly to preach obedience and patience to the enslaved population. The rice fields shimmered in the heat, and the usual routines of plantation life continued with their grinding regularity. But as evening approached, as the sun began its descent toward the treen, a different tension filled the air. Hannah had noticed it first during the morning hours. Fournier had emerged from his study earlier than usual, his movements jerky and agitated. He'd walked the grounds with unusual intensity, stopping to stare at groups of enslaved workers with an expression that mixed calculation and something darker. The white overseer, Jacob Trent, had tried to speak with him twice, but Fournier had waved him away both times, muttering to himself in French. By afternoon, word had spread through the quarters that something was different, though no one could say exactly what. When the bell rang for the Sunday evening gathering, the 38 women made their way to the tobacco barn with a heightened awareness that this night might be unlike the previous 400 or so Sundays they'd endured. Sarah walked close to her mother, and Hannah could feel her daughter's hand trembling slightly as it brushed against her own. Around them, the other women moved in their customary silence, but their eyes were alert, watchful. The barn door stood open, and the lamplight spilling from within seemed harsher than usual, casting sharp shadows across the threshold. As they entered, the first thing they noticed was the change in arrangement. The benches had been pushed back against the walls, creating an open space in the center of the room. In that space stood a single chair, isolated and somehow ominous in its solitude. The small table with Fournier's journal remained, but additional items had been added. Several coils of rope, a wooden box that none of them recognized, and a larger ledger book that appeared new. Fournier stood at the far end of the barn, and when he turned to face them, several women drew sharp breaths. His appearance was shocking. The man who had always presented himself with meticulous care, whose clothing and bearings spoke of European refinement, now looked like someone who hadn't slept in days. His eyes were bloodshot and wild, his collar was stained with sweat, and his hands trembled slightly as he gestured for them to enter. "Come in, all of you," he said, his voice. "Take your positions around the perimeter. Tonight's gathering will be different from all the others. Tonight we reach the conclusion of our long experiment." As the women arranged themselves along the walls, Celeste emerged from the shadows in the corner, and the sight of her drew audible gasps from several of the younger women. The free woman of color, who had always maintained an air of careful composure, despite her complicity in Fournier's scheme, was clearly injured. One eye was swollen nearly shut, her lip was split, and she moved with the careful rigidity of someone in considerable pain. But it was her expression that was most disturbing, a blank, dissociated stare that suggested something inside her had broken beyond repair. In her hands she carried several lengths of rope, their ends frayed and ready for use. She placed them on the floor near the isolated chair, then stepped back, never once making eye contact with any of the assembled women. Fournier began to pace, his movements erratic and unpredictable. 8 years, he said, speaking more to himself than to them. 8 years of careful observation, of testing and refining my theories, and what have I learned? That the human animal, even in its most degraded form, possesses a cunning that defies rational categorization. That the Negro, despite all scientific evidence of inferior mental capacity, can develop strategies of resistance that operate below the threshold of direct confrontation. He stopped pacing and fixed his gaze on the assembled women. "You've been subverting my experiment, not through open rebellion, which would be easy to counter, but through subtle manipulations of the voting patterns. You found ways to distribute consequences, to protect certain individuals, to send messages through your choices that undermine the very purpose of the exercise. I've documented all of it, studied it, tried to understand the mechanism, but documentation is not enough. Science requires experimentation, and experimentation requires testing hypotheses to their ultimate conclusions." Hannah felt her heart hammering in her chest, but she forced herself to remain still to show no outward reaction around her. The other women maintained their silence, though she could sense the fear radiating from them like heat. "Tonight," Fournier continued, his voice rising in pitch, "we dispense with the pretense of limited consequences. Tonight, the game becomes what it was always meant to be, a pure test of moral choice under absolute duress. You will vote as you have voted every Sunday for 8 years, but tonight you vote for who lives." He let the words hang in the air for a long moment before continuing. "The person who receives the most votes will be spared. She will be set free, given papers of manumission, provided with money to travel north, released from bondage entirely, but everyone else, all 37 others, will face a different fate." The implications of his words began to settle over the room like a suffocating blanket. Several of the younger women began to weep quietly. Patience, the 19-year-old house servant, swayed on her feet as though she might faint. Minnie clutched at the wall behind her for support. Fournier walked to the table and opened the new ledger book. I have made all the necessary arrangements. My overseer has been sent to Charleston on business and will not return until Tuesday. The field hands have been confined to their quarters with instructions that anyone who leaves before morning will be shot on sight. The white servants have been given the evening off and are currently in town. We are alone here, you, me, and Celeste. What happens in this barn tonight will be witnessed by no one who holds any legal standing to testify about it." He began pulling items from the wooden box. Blank pieces of paper, small sticks of charcoal, and something else that made Hannah's blood run cold. A pistol, not the one he typically carried, but a larger weapon along with additional ammunition and powder. He arranged these items on the table with careful precision, the gesture both methodical and deeply threatening. "The voting will proceed as it always has," Fournier said, his voice taking on a lecturing quality as though he were explaining a scientific procedure to students. "Each of you will receive a paper. You will write the name of the person you believe should be granted freedom. Celeste will collect the votes. I will count them and announce the result. The entire process should take no more than an hour." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice dropped to something almost gentle, which was somehow more frightening than if he'd shouted, "I know what some of you are thinking. You believe you can refuse to participate, or that you can all vote for the same person in some act of collective defiance. But understand this, if I detect any pattern suggesting coordination, if the votes do not reflect genuine individual choice, then I will make the selection myself, and I will do so in a manner designed to maximize your suffering. The only path forward is through honest participation in the exercise." Hannah's mind raced through possibilities, each more desperate than the last. If they refused to vote, Fournier would kill them according to his own selection, probably choosing those he perceived as leaders or instigators. If they voted randomly, he would still kill 37 of them based on whatever criteria he'd established. If they somehow all voted for one person, attempting to save at least that individual, they'd be condemning themselves while potentially exposing whoever they chose to survivor's guilt, so profound it might be worse than death. But there was something else. Something in Fournier's agitation and the extremity of his plan that suggested weakness rather than strength. He had designed a system that depended on their psychological submission, and that system was failing. This final escalation wasn't a demonstration of control. It was an act of desperation by a man whose theories were collapsing around him. The question was whether that made him more or less dangerous. The answer came as Hannah noticed Celeste's position in the room. The free woman stood near the door, her body angled in a way that suggested she wanted to flee, but didn't dare. More importantly, her injured state meant that Fournier had already lost control of one key element of his system. Celeste was no longer a willing participant. She was another victim, and victims could become allies. Hannah caught Celeste's eye for just a moment, and in that brief connection she saw something flicker in the other woman's expression. Not hope exactly, but a recognition, a shared understanding that they were all trapped in Fournier's madness, and that survival would require breaking the rules of engagement he'd established. Fournier began distributing the papers himself, moving from woman to woman with the charcoal sticks. As he approached Hannah, she noticed the slight tremor in his hands, the way his breathing came too fast and shallow. He was terrified, she realized. Terrified of what he was about to do, yes, but more terrified of the possibility that his experiment would fail, that his 8 years of carefully constructed psychological torture would be revealed as ultimately ineffective. When he reached Sarah, Hannah's 14-year-old daughter, something shifted in the room's atmosphere. Sarah stood straight, her young face composed in a way that reminded Hannah of herself. When Fournier held out the paper, Sarah didn't take it. "You must take this and vote," Fournier said, his voice controlled but tight with warning. "I heard you," Sarah said quietly, "but I'm not going to." The barn went absolutely silent. Even the sounds from outside, the frogs, the insects, the distant movement of animals seemed to fade away, leaving only the crackling of the lamps and the sound of Fournier's increasingly rapid breathing. "You will take this paper," he repeated, his voice beginning to rise. "And you will write a name." "Or I will—" "You'll what?" Sarah interrupted, and her voice was steady despite her youth. "You'll kill me. You're going to do that anyway. You just told us that 37 of us are going to die tonight. So what difference does it make if I vote or not?" Hannah felt her heart seize with simultaneous pride and terror. Sarah was right, logically right, but Logic didn't protect you from violence. Still, something in her daughter's words resonated through the room, planting a seed of understanding in the other women's minds. Fournier's face flushed dark red and his hand moved toward the pistol on the table, but before he could reach it, Hannah stepped forward, positioning herself between him and her daughter. "No," she said, and the word came out with 8 years of accumulated rage behind it. "We're not doing this." Fournier turned to her, his eyes wide with something between fury and panic. "You don't have a choice. The game requires our participation," Hannah interrupted, and she felt the weight of every Sunday evening, every forced choice, every moment of manufactured guilt flowing into her words. "And we're done participating. Every week for 8 years, we've played by your rules because you made us believe the consequences of refusal would be worse than the consequences of compliance. But you've reached the end of what you can threaten us with." She turned to face the other women, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. "He's going to kill us anyway, he's told us that. So we have nothing left to lose by refusing. We're not voting, we're not going to choose who lives and who dies. We're not going to play his game anymore." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Patience, the young house servant, stepped forward to stand beside Hannah. "I'm not voting either." Minnie joined them. "Nor am I." Delia moved forward, her weathered face set with determination. "I won't do it." One by one, the women began to rise from their positions along the walls and move toward the center of the room, creating a living barrier between Fournier and his carefully laid-out instruments of death. Sarah stood with her mother, and soon all 38 women were gathered together, their bodies forming a collective refusal that couldn't be ignored or explained away. Fournier stared at them, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, rage, and something that might have been fear. His hand closed around the pistol on the table, and he raised it with a shaking grip, pointing it first at Hannah, then sweeping it across the assembled group. "You're making a mistake," he said. But his voice had lost its commanding edge. It was the voice of a man watching his life's work crumble. "I can still enforce the consequences. I have the means, I have the authority. You are my property and you can what?" Hannah demanded, taking a step closer to him despite the weapon. "Kill all of us. Shoot 38 women one by one. Do you have enough ammunition for that? Enough time before someone hears the shots and comes to investigate? Enough strength to dispose of all our bodies before morning?" She took another step and something in Fournier's expression cracked. The pistol wavered in his hand. "Or maybe you'll just kill some of us," Hannah continued, her voice hard as iron. "Maybe you'll shoot me or Sarah or a few others to make your point. But that won't make the rest of them vote. It'll just prove that you're no different from any other enslaver. That all your talk of science and psychology and experiments was just a fancy way of dressing up the same old violence." The truth of her words hung in the air between them. Fournier's entire identity, his sense of himself as different from other planters, as a man of intellect and refinement, conducting legitimate research, depended on the fiction that his methods were sophisticated rather than brutal. If he resorted to mass murder, he would be admitting that his theories were worthless, that 8 years of careful observation and documentation had produced nothing but the same crude domination that any ignorant overseer with a whip could achieve. "You're already dying," Hannah said, speaking more softly now, but with no less intensity. "Maybe not your body, not yet, but whatever you thought you were, whatever you believed you were building here, it's dead. We killed it by refusing to help you anymore. And you know what? We're still here. We're still alive. We're still human beings with thoughts and feelings and the capacity to choose, even if the only choice we have left is the choice to say no." The moment stretched taut as a drumhead. Fournier's finger was on the trigger, his entire body trembling with emotion too complex to name. The women stood together, and though many of them were crying, though their faces showed their terror, they didn't break formation, they didn't step back. Then Celeste moved. She had been standing near the door holding the remaining papers, and now she let them fall from her hands. They scattered across the floor like leaves, and in the silence the sound of them landing seemed impossibly loud. "I can't do this anymore," Celeste said, her voice cracking. She looked at Fournier with her one good eye, and tears streamed down her bruised face. "I thought I was free because you gave me papers. I thought I was different from them because I could walk away if I wanted to. But I couldn't, could I? I've been as trapped as they are. Maybe more trapped because I had to pretend I had a choice. I've helped you torture these women for 8 years, and I won't do it anymore." She turned to Hannah. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what I've helped him do to you, but I'm done. If he's going to kill us, then at least we'll die refusing to be part of his sick experiment." Fournier's face went through a transformation that would have been almost comical if the circumstances had been less dire. The realization that both his subjects and his assistant had rebelled simultaneously seemed to break something fundamental in him. The pistol in his hand slowly lowered, his arm falling to his side as though all the strength had drained from his muscles. "Get out," he whispered. And at first the words were so quiet that no one was sure they'd heard correctly. Then louder. "Get out. All of you, get out of my sight." No one moved at first, uncertainty holding them in place. Was this another trick, another layer to the game? Would he shoot them as they tried to leave? But then Hannah saw his face, really saw it, and understood that this was surrender. The game was over. She gestured to the other women, and slowly, cautiously, they began to move toward the door. Sarah stayed close to her mother, and Patience kept glancing back over her shoulder, as though expecting Fournier to change his mind. As they filed out into the evening air, Hannah was the last to leave. She paused at the threshold and looked back at Fournier, who had collapsed into the isolated chair, his head in his hands, the pistol lying forgotten on the floor beside him. She felt no triumph in that moment, no sense of victory, only exhaustion and a deep abiding sorrow for all that had been lost, for the years that could never be reclaimed, for the innocence and trust and community that his game had destroyed. "We were always human beings," she said quietly. "You could have learned that without torturing us." Then she turned and walked out into the night where 37 other women were gathered in the yard, holding each other and weeping with relief and residual terror, and the strange, disorienting sensation of having survived something that should have killed them. The stars were brilliant overhead, and the smell of honeysuckle drifted on the warm air, and for a moment, just a moment, they could breathe. The night of May 15, 1854, marked the last of the Sunday gatherings, but it did not mark the end of Fournier's presence at Harrowfield. The women returned to their quarters that evening in a state of shock suspension, unable to fully process what had happened or what it might mean for their futures. They had defied Fournier and survived. But they were still enslaved, still trapped on his property, still subject to his legal authority as their owner. Hannah spent that night in conversation with several of the other women, particularly Celeste, who had accompanied them to the quarters rather than returning to her own accommodations. The free woman's injuries needed tending, but more than that, she needed to speak, to confess the full extent of her complicity, and to share what she knew about Fournier's state of mind. "He's been breaking down for months," Celeste told them, her voice narrow with pain and emotion. "The voting patterns you developed frustrated him terribly. He would spend hours analyzing them, trying to determine if there was coordination or if it was genuinely random. He became convinced that you were communicating in ways he couldn't detect, that there was some language or system operating beneath his observation." She touched her swollen eye gingerly. "When he discovered that I'd been copying his journals, something in him snapped. He'd always prided himself on his rationality, his scientific detachment. But that night, he was neither rational nor detached. He was terrified that his work would be exposed, that people would see what he'd done here and judge him as just another cruel enslaver rather than the intellectual he believed himself to be." Hannah listened carefully, understanding that this information might be important for what came next. "What do you think he'll do now?" Celeste shook her head slowly. "I don't know. A man like Fournier, whose entire sense of self is built around his theories and experiments. When those collapse, what's left? He could try to reassert control through violence. He could attempt to sell the plantation and flee, or he could." She trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the thought. The following morning, Monday, May 16th, brought an eerie normalcy to Harrowfield. The overseer, Jacob Trent, returned from Charleston and immediately noticed something wrong. The enslaved population was working the rice fields as usual, but there was a different quality to their movements, a collective tension that he couldn't quite identify. When he went to report to Fournier, he found the man in his study surrounded by open journals and loose papers, staring blankly at the wall. "Sir," Trent ventured, "is everything all right?" Fournier didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, emotionless. "The experiment is concluded. There will be no more Sunday gatherings. Make a note of it in the plantation records." Trent, who had never been privy to the details of what occurred in those gatherings, accepted this information with puzzlement, but no argument. Over the following days, he noticed other changes in Fournier's behavior. The man stopped making his usual rounds of the property, stopped recording observations in his journals, stopped attending to the business of plantation management. He remained in his study for hours at a time, sometimes emerging disheveled and muttering in French, other times not emerging at all. Hannah, meanwhile, took advantage of this period of neglect to accomplish something crucial. Working with Celeste and several trusted women, she retrieved all of the hidden documents that Celeste had copied from Fournier's journals. There were more than they'd expected. Over 200 pages chronicling every Sunday gathering, every vote, every consequence, along with Fournier's pseudoscientific analysis and theoretical frameworks. The question became what to do with these documents. They couldn't simply destroy them as they represented the only concrete evidence of what had happened at Harrowfield, but neither could they risk keeping them where Fournier might find and destroy them himself. After much deliberation, Hannah made a decision that would prove crucial for the preservation of this history. She selected several locations off the plantation property, places where free black people lived and worked, people who had occasional contact with Harrowfield through trade or church gatherings. Over the course of several weeks, she managed to smuggle portions of the documents to these locations, entrusting them to individuals who understood their significance and promised to keep them safe. It was dangerous work, requiring careful planning and the cooperation of several people who risked severe punishment if caught. One of these individuals was Reverend Thomas Jenkins, a free black minister who preached at the church where the enslaved population of several plantations gathered monthly. Hannah approached him after a service in late May, pressing a wrapped package into his hands and whispering urgently about its contents. "These are records of what was done to us," she told him. "They're written in the Master's own hand. If anything happens to us, if we don't survive what comes next, someone needs to know what happened here. Someone needs to tell the story." Reverend Jenkins took the package with solemn understanding. He had heard whispers about the Sunday gatherings at Harrowfield, though he'd never known the full extent of what occurred. "I'll keep these safe," he promised, "and if the Lord grants me the opportunity, I'll make sure the truth is known." Similar conversations took place with others. A free woman who ran a boarding house in Boot, a black barber who served both enslaved and free populations, a cook who worked for a sympathetic white family. Each person received a portion of the documents, creating a distributed archive that would be difficult for anyone to completely destroy. As June arrived, Fournier's deterioration became more pronounced. The plantation's financial records began to show irregularities, bills left unpaid, shipments of rice that should have been sold but remained in storage, correspondence from his factory in Charleston going unanswered. Trent, the overseer, found himself making decisions that should have been Fournier, trying to keep the plantation functioning despite the absence of real leadership. The enslaved population, meanwhile, existed in a strange state of suspended animation. The Sunday gatherings had ended, but the trauma they'd inflicted remained. The women who had participated found themselves struggling with the psychological aftermath of 8 years of forced complicity. Some withdrew into silence even deeper than before. Others experienced nightmares, waking terrors that left them shaking and unable to return to sleep. A few, like Hannah, channeled their trauma into a kind of fierce determination to survive and bear witness. Sarah, at 14, showed a resilience that both impressed and worried her mother. The girl seemed to have emerged from the final confrontation with Fournier, convinced of her own power to resist. But Hannah knew that such conviction could be dangerous for an enslaved person. She tried to teach her daughter the delicate balance between maintaining dignity and avoiding the kind of direct defiance that could get you killed. What we did that night was necessary, Hannah told Sarah one evening as they sat outside their cabin, but it only worked because Fournier's whole system depended on our participation. Most enslavers don't care about your psychology or your choices. They'll just use the whip. You have to know when to resist and when to survive. Sarah nodded, but Hannah could see the fire in her daughter's eyes. The kind of fire that couldn't easily be extinguished. It worried her. It also gave her hope. July brought a heat wave that made work in the rice fields nearly unbearable. The standing water seemed to steam in the sun, and the mosquitoes were thick enough to form visible clouds. It was during this oppressive heat that Fournier finally emerged from his self-imposed isolation, appearing one morning at breakfast in the main house, looking gaunt and feverish. He called for Trent and informed him that the plantation was to be sold. The overseer was shocked. Harrowfield was a valuable property, and there was no obvious financial reason for such a drastic decision. But Fourier was adamant, and he had already contacted several potential buyers through his factory in Charleston. News of the impending sale spread quickly through the enslaved quarters, bringing a mixture of fear and cautious hope. Sale meant uncertainty. Families could be separated. Individuals could be sent to harsher conditions. The familiar rhythms of life at Harrowfield would be disrupted. But it also meant the end of Fournier's presence. And for the women who had endured his Sunday gatherings, that prospect held undeniable appeal. The sale process moved quickly, perhaps too quickly for a property of Harrowfield's size and value. Fourier seemed desperate to be rid of it, accepting a price that observers considered below market value. The buyer was a planter named William Hawkins, known for running his properties with brutal efficiency, but without Fournier's psychological sophistication. The enslaved population would face different cruelties, more traditional ones, but at least they would be comprehensible cruelties. The transition was set for mid-August. Fournier had planned to leave for France as soon as the sale of Harrowfield was complete. He spoke of retreating into a quiet countryside home where he would finally write up what he believed were groundbreaking discoveries about human psychology under constraint. In his mind, the experiment had not failed. It had simply produced unexpected data. But on August 9, 1854, everything changed. It began with a fever. A chill, symptoms common to the low country in late summer. A local doctor examined him and diagnosed marsh fever. Rest and fluids, he said. Yet, within days, Fournier's condition spiraled into something far more serious. He became delirious, raving in French about failed theories, about subjects who wouldn't cooperate, about variables he could no longer control. His skin yellowed, his stomach twisted in agony, and the doctor's return visit ended in a grim expression. Perhaps yellow fever, he said, or perhaps something else entirely. Medicine at the time had limits. Celeste was summoned to care for him. She agreed, but only reluctantly. Through the long nights, she sat beside his bed as he drifted in and out of lucidity. Later, she would tell Hannah what she had witnessed, how fever stripped away Fournier's polished composure and revealed the man beneath the theories. He kept talking about the experiment, she said quietly, about how it should have worked, how the women were too contaminated by previous conditioning. He couldn't accept that the flaw was his. Even dying, he was defending the design. But there were other moments, brief flashes of clarity, when he seemed almost aware of what he had done. Once he grabbed Celeste's hand and whispered, "I thought I was better than the others, but I was worse, wasn't I? Worse because I made them complicit. Whether it was remorse or delirium, no one knew. Celeste offered no comfort. She cared for his body, nothing more." Fournier died on August 17th, 9 days after falling ill, 3 days before Harrowfield was scheduled to change ownership. Official cause, marsh fever. Unofficial whispers, perhaps something else. Some noted how convenient the timing was. Others pointed out Celeste's deep knowledge of herbs and poisons that could mimic natural illness. But no investigation followed. In the low country, white men died of fever all the time. The sale of Harrowfield proceeded without interruption. William Hawkins arrived in late August and immediately changed work schedules, routines, and management. The tobacco barn, the place where the Sunday ritual had broken so many spirits, was cleared out, stripped of benches, and turned into storage for rice. But for the women who had endured 8 years of psychological torture, the change in ownership brought only partial relief. Healing did not come. The silence they had learned as survival became part of them. Trust was fragile. Many could not step foot in the barn without trembling or experiencing waves of panic. Hannah became a quiet counselor to them, offering comfort, wisdom, and understanding. She knew trauma doesn't vanish when the source disappears. It lingers in the body, in the reflexes, the fears, the habits that once kept you alive. 7 years later, the Civil War arrived. It brought chaos, hunger, disease, and eventually emancipation. Hannah lived to see freedom. Sarah did not. She died in 1863 during a plantation-wide illness, one more life taken by the brutal instability of the war years. After emancipation, Hannah settled in Beaufort, a community formed by formerly enslaved families. She worked as a laundress and midwife, and became a grandmother figure to many, steadfast, wise, and endlessly patient. She never remarried nor bore another child, but she carried Sarah's memory with her always. It was during these years that Hannah deliberately preserved the story of Harrowfield. She knew written documents were fragile, so she passed the truth down through oral history, teaching younger people exactly what had happened, insisting the story be remembered. People need to know, she would say, not just what was done to us, but how we survived it. She died in 1881, around 61 years old, leaving behind a legacy of truth-telling that outlived both Fournier and the system that had tried to silence her. The scattered documents resurfaced slowly. In 1897, after Reverend Jenkins died, his daughter found a sealed package he had promised to protect. Recognizing its importance, she donated it to a new historical society dedicated to preserving African American history in the Low Country. Other papers emerged in similar ways until, eventually, the entire collection was brought together. For decades, few cared. Slavery was treated as an embarrassment, something to minimize. But as scholars began studying the psychological methods of enslavement, not just the physical brutality, Fournier's journals were recognized as a chilling and essential record. What made them extraordinary was the dual perspective, the enslaver's cold analysis and the survivor's memories side by side. Modern psychologists now identify Fournier's ritual as an extreme form of what's called coerced complicity, a system designed to force victims to participate in their own suffering. This form of manipulation creates deep, lasting harm because it corrodes identity, dignity, and the sense of self. Historians debate whether Fournier's experiment was unique. The answer seems to be both. The ritual itself was unusual, but the principles behind it, psychological domination, forced complicity, were woven throughout slavery. The tobacco barn still stands. In 2018, a historical marker was placed there. Visitors stop occasionally, though most leave quickly. For those who know the full story, the barn is not just a structure, it is a memorial, a reminder of cruelty, a testament to resistance. Each year, descendants of those enslaved at Harrowfield gather near the site. They read the 38 names, they honor Hannah. They observe a moment of silence, not the silence forced upon their ancestors, but a chosen silence transformed into respect. What happened at Harrowfield was not just history, it was a lesson about the nature of power, control, and survival. It forces us to ask, how do people maintain humanity when everything is designed to destroy it? What forms can resistance take when open defiance means death? And what happens when human beings, even under extreme oppression, collectively refuse to participate in their own subjugation? These are not just questions about the past, they echo into the present. If this story spoke to you, changed your understanding of psychological oppression, or made you reflect on the legacy of slavery, leave a comment below. Share your thoughts. Share this story. And if you believe forgotten histories must be remembered, hit the like button, subscribe, and join us for more. Thank you for listening. Thank you for bearing witness to Hannah, Sarah, and the women of Harrowfield. Their courage endures, their story matters. I'll see you in the next video where we continue uncovering the dark corners of American history that still shape our world.